Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. This is an exciting event. It's our second year doing an autonomous vehicle event out of the Clean Tech Committee. I'd just like to recognize the four members who put in a lot of hours to come up with this topic and organize it. Gus Sameo, who's right in front here, Vanessa Fox, who's way in the back, and Alex Bach, who's in the middle there. Thank you guys all. This is a volunteer-driven event, and if you like the topic and want to do something next year, have some ideas about a topic for next year, let's talk afterwards. As a reminder, so the agenda, I think Katya probably went over the agenda from 6 to 7:30. We're going to have a panel Q&A, and Dylan will tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then at 7:30, we're going to move upstairs to the 4th floor R&D pub for networking from 7:30 to 8. It's a little tricky to get there. We'll guide you there. We'd like to ask you not to stay here, but to move upstairs because there's drinks and light refreshments up there. So that's about it for logistics. This year's topic, of course, it's, we wanted to give it a clean tech feel, and there's a lot of clean tech impact in autonomous vehicles. Not, the potential for emissions and energy consumption really could go either way depending on the policies and the technology that's put in place. So we feel like it's a valid clean tech topic. And what we really wanted to get after, in keeping with the mission of the MIT Enterprise Forum, is to look at the entrepreneurial opportunities that will spin off once there's a critical mass of autonomous vehicles somewhere. So we're not looking at the technology of autonomous vehicles so much. We're not looking about when. Everybody wants to know when, and I'm not sure anybody knows definitely. There's lots of opinions. But we'd like to explore the knock-on opportunities that will come in services and equipment. I've already talked to a few people here today who are active in some areas outside of the autonomous vehicle area that will certainly foretells opportunity coming from autonomous vehicles. So that's the mission tonight, is to illuminate those follow-on opportunities. And the person who's going to run both the moderated Q&A session and the second half of the panel discussion, which is questions from the audience, is Dylan Martin. Dylan is a staff writer at Bosch and has been gracious enough both to help us in terms of publicity for his column. He writes a daily blog, which I think is fantastic in terms of talking about technology in this area as well as other technology areas in the Boston area. He's covered the Newtonomy story and others. So Dylan, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. So I'm Dylan. I am a staff writer for Boston, just like Jeff said, and I feel like every other week I have a news item to run about autonomous vehicles. It's kind of been snowballing for the last few years. About 6 months into my job, so I started 2.5 years ago, I wrote about Newtonomy's first funding round, and little did we know what about a 1.5 years later they would get acquired. So I'm going to start off by letting all the other panelists introduce each other. I'll start with Chris.
Hello, everyone. I'm Augustine Wegscheider from BCG. I'm actually here in a little bit of two functions. One, I'm a principal at the Automotive Mobility Practice in our Chicago office, but I also lead our work on autonomous driving with the World Economic Forum. So BCG has been involved with the forum for about 5 years, and every year we have a so-called secondee who joins the forum on a 10-month basis to run a project. For a quick personal introduction, I've always been a mobility geek. I actually started my career 12 years ago at Siemens, which at the time was the only company I could find that had trains and cars. I'm like, this is fantastic, sign me up. I joined the in-house consulting groups. I could do projects for both. What I didn't know is that we're going to sell the automotive division to Continental 4 months later. So did a little bit of work on the rail side, and then joined actually Audi of America in the US. Worked 4 years at Audi on the OEM side. And I thought, hey, there's so much happening in this industry. I don't just want to be at an OEM. I want to look at it broader. And joined BCG 2.5 years ago. I'm very happy to be here at MIT today because since May, I've been working very closely with the city of Boston They are the partner city of the World Economic Forum Initiative on Urban and Autonomous Driving. So Nutonomy has been one of our partners. Optimus Ride, also an MIT startup. And lastly, Delphi, now called Aptiv, is the third company testing EVs in Boston. So we've done a lot of work around what does AV mean for the city of Boston? How does it fit in the mobility ecosystem? How will traffic patterns change? With a lot of consumer research. So I'm happy to share some of those findings throughout the discussion. Happy to be here.
Great. I'm Chris Thomas. I'm a founder and a partner with Fontanalis Partners. We're a venture capital firm focused uniquely on investing in next generation mobility. So we define that, it's important to keep this in mind very broadly, the movement of goods, people, and services empowered by technology. So we have 40 plus investments around the world, everything from road, rail, bike, air, autonomous land, air, and sea, and then empowering technologies, holistic robotics, cybersecurity, AI, and the like. And they had a number of exits recently. Nutonomy was a company that we're very proud to have invested in, the only institutional investor that invested in both its seed and its Series A. You had the pleasure of following it. I had the pleasure of living it with those founders. Just a tremendous story when you think about what they've done and how, more importantly, how they did it. And just very pleasure to be here today. Based in Detroit, had a chance to be here with my partner from Boston. You're kind to have a Midwesterner among you, so thanks for having me.
So my name is Chris Cheever. I'm the second of three Chris's actually at the firm. It's
True.
Sort of confusing, but you luckily only got two. I happen to be the Boston partner, so I'm sort of the scout locally, if you will, for a lot of things going on in this market. I had the pleasure of working with Chris at Nutonomy as sort of an observer on that board, but do a lot of work with a bunch of other local companies as well as companies outside of the Boston region. As Chris said, he's described the firm, but we founded the firm together back in 2009. So it's all we do is think about mobility and opportunities to deploy capital in it.
Hi, I'm Chris Bird, founder of Africa LLC. I'm also half-time appointment at MIT Media Lab. So my background is I worked for Chrysler and General Motors. I'm based in Detroit. I invented the skateboard architecture at GM when we did the GM autonomy concept, and have about 30 patents on that. And then also led the development of the world's first autonomous connected electric vehicle, which was developed by GM in 2010 for the Shanghai World Expo. I left GM to join Qualcomm because I saw the car becoming a smartphone on wheels, and I wanted to get under the hood, so to speak, and learn more about the car from the technology company's point of view. But based on some volunteer work I had done in Africa, I was compelled to leave Qualcomm and to focus on a solution for the underserved communities of the world. So it's a solar-powered vehicle that can be locally made out of local materials and provides power and transport. So I think this type of solution is very relevant for the future of the Western mobility as well, because we have to get a lot more intelligent about mobility, and just electric cars by themselves are not the solution. We need to think very carefully about where the materials for those electric cars come from, and how do we reduce the strain on the electric grid, and how do we create more and more jobs that may be lost through automation. So I have ideas for vehicles that can be developed and made locally, using local materials, using solar power extensively, and reusing lithium batteries, which I think will become increasingly important for Western mobility as well. Thank you.
Great. I'm Chris as well. No, just joking. I'm Jessica. My name is Jessica Transick, and I'm a professor at the Institute for Data Systems and Society at MIT. And I do research on identifying solutions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from energy systems that are used for transportation and electricity. And I run a research group, and we build data-informed models to answer a range of questions about how to reduce emissions and energy consumption in the transportation sector while also increasing functionality. So one of the main models that we've built over the years allows us to identify on a second-by-second basis how cars around the country are consuming energy. And from this, we can answer questions like, is range anxiety justified if you're looking at a certain electric car and a certain battery capacity? How much of the country's travel demand will be met by that car on an individual basis and across all cities in the country? We're also expanding to look at these questions internationally. We're also looking at how you can provide incentives to people to reduce their energy consumption and their emissions. And so that's one of the big projects we're working on. We're asking questions like, what exactly are the emissions, the greenhouse gas emission savings and air pollutant reductions that you get from electric vehicles? What are the costs of those for consumers? So if you want to check out your car and how it compares to other cars on the street, you can look at an app that we recently launched, which is called carboncounter.com. And so basically the idea behind this research is to try to move from adjectives to numbers. So rather than say a car is green or clean, how clean is it? How does it compare to climate targets? This raises a lot of interesting questions about autonomy, and I'll share some insights that we have, but there's also a lot of really big open questions about the effect that autonomous vehicles could have on energy consumption and climate change, but there's also a lot of opportunities that this brings up.
All right. So just to keep things clear, whenever I have to butt in, I'm just going to say Chris 1, Chris 2, and Chris 3.
That's good.
Just to keep things simple. All right. So before I kind of launch into questions, I'm just going to put out a few figures or predictions that I pulled up before I left for here. According to Boston Consulting Group, by 2035, it's expected there will be 12 million fully autonomous vehicles sold annually on a global level. When you talk about semi-autonomous, we're talking 18 million cars sold. I don't know how old that research is, but
Probably outdated by now. 2 years.
how, Augustine,
It moves fast.
do you think the number is bigger now?
Well, so I think it's an interesting question because you have to look at kind of two ways of autonomous vehicles. I think a lot of the discussion is around I go to the dealer and I can buy an autonomous car that goes everywhere.
Right.
I think that's actually pretty far out, maybe 15, 20 years. I don't know exactly. But I think what we see is coming much quicker than anticipated is kind of the shared autonomous electric vehicle, where you see the Nutonomies and the Optimus Ride of this world and Waymo and you name it, everybody being very active right now and having trials all around the country and around the world, where I think Nutonomy is launching commercial service very soon in Singapore. So I think that's coming much quicker than we thought 2 years ago.
Okay. And trust me, we're not going to belabor on are autonomous vehicles going to be a thing? They are, since this is the whole point. But just one more thing, a think tank called Rethink X predicts that autonomous vehicles will lead to abandonment of car ownership. I don't think that's a stretch to imagine, especially the way we've been talking about shared car models, and just a few companies that have been targeting for rollouts in addition to Nutonomy. Alphabet, which is the owner of Google, and Ford are targeting 2020 for commercial rollouts. So with that, I wanted to kind of just do a quick poll, and I'm sure some people will kind of be biased for certain answers, but whatever comes to mind, what are when you have so many autonomous vehicles on the road, what's the first opportunity that comes to mind for you? And I'll start with you, Augustine.
The first opportunity, I think, is providing more equitable mobility access. I think one of the challenges we also see in Boston is making sure everybody has an equal access to mobility services. And I think autonomous vehicles can play an important role in that.
All right, Chris 1.
I think it's. Sorry, I'm always distracted. Chris 1. This is my night. I think it's going to be the optimization of the rider experience. What I mean by that is, right now, we can utilize data to understand. Each of us have a unique mobility utility in this room. What is our mode preference? What is the amount of money we have to spend for any one trip? And what is the time we have for that trip? That can be multimodal, that can be one mode. We have the data to do that today. And if I'm traveling with my 2-year-old son to go get groceries, and I need a hatchback for half an hour, that hatchback can be deployed on an autonomous system within a geo-fenced area. If I'm going camping for the weekend, I'm going to need an SUV to put my gear with my wife, again with my son. Also, by the way, that's going to need a child seat. We're going to be able to deploy those types of systems seamlessly based on the utility, my mobility utility, and the distinct needs that I have as an individual. And I think that's something that, when I think about autonomy as a component of overall mobility, that's really exciting.
All right. Or middle Chris, I can say too.
I'd highlight two things which touch in some ways on what Chris was saying. But I think consumption of services in the vehicle itself is going to be really interesting over time. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what consumers will want to do or what businesses will do inside the vehicles themselves once they're freed up to do whatever they need to do or want to do with the time that they have in that asset. I also think that you're going to see real estate repurposed in countless ways. And that's going to be just a fascinating trend to invest in for some and to participate in for others. So.
Yeah. All right. Other Chris?
Chris 3?
Chris 3.
I think I agree. The user experience inside the vehicle is going to be a big deal, especially for privately owned vehicles. I think logistics is a big one, especially when you have a bottom line dollar savings that's very immediately apparent, and you have a trained operator in the vehicle who can be relied upon to take over when need be, which isn't necessarily the case with a privately owned vehicle. Yeah. But I think it's a much less risky scenario to imagine a level 4 autonomous vehicle in a logistics application.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jessica?
Yeah, well, one of the aspects that I'm most excited about, and really here I'm talking about the potential application, and I can talk about how difficult or easy that may be to achieve in a minute. But with autonomy, we could potentially support the transition to electrification of vehicles. And if you look just at personal vehicles, by switching to an electric powertrain, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% or more, even with today's electricity supply mix. So it can have a really major impact on greenhouse gas emissions. How does autonomy potentially relate to this? Well, there are certain long-range trips or long-range days where electric vehicles may not be able to travel the distance, but if people knew that they could immediately order a long-range car as easily as they order an Uber today, that may take away some of that range anxiety. And autonomy could really help enable this because you could potentially have getting those cars around to people when they need them could really be helped and enabled by autonomy. So that's one of the things we've been looking at in my research group and one of the applications of the model that I mentioned.
Go ahead.
We often think of the US, but if you look at the electric vehicle market, a big market is going to be China, huge market for electric vehicles, and not everybody has their own garage in China. So if autonomous vehicles could really be helpful at night, these electric cars could be parked at home, but then they go off and charge somewhere by themselves, and then they come back in the morning for when you need it.
Well, yeah, and I should add to, the scenario I just laid out is one where we're assuming personal vehicles and personal ownership, private ownership of vehicles, but you could imagine a completely shared fleet, which in some ways would be a lot more efficient in getting cars to people when they need them. But that may be a little bit further off, but even today you could go for the innovation that I just talked about and then sort of transition to this more kind of larger transformation.
It's rare that I'm on panels that are this big, but what I love about all these answers is you can see that there's such deep and powerful use cases. And we're all pulling on ones that are top of mind for us, but we could all go on, I'm sure, for 10 more. There's so many different ways in which this is going to affect the movement of goods, people, and services. And it's exciting to kind of understand that, what that will mean for all of us.
And I think one of the biggest benefits we didn't talk about is safety.
Yeah.
You have 94% of accidents are caused by human error today. So I think while the conversation right now is very focused about how can you prove to me that this particular AV is not going to cause an accident, I think if we look big picture in a couple of years, we're actually going to see massive improvements in road deaths. Right now, we're actually, after a long decline, we're on an uptick because I think level 3 is actually a little bit dangerous. It gives users the illusion my car is autonomous, I have the autopilot, it can do it by itself. But actually level 3 still means the driver is in charge and is in control and has to be able to take over at all times. But I think when we get to level 4, level 5 autonomy, we'll see a big reduction in fatalities on roads.
I don't blame ADAS. I blame Facebook for that.
Yeah, I mean the number of level 3 vehicles on the road is very, 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 very small at the moment, and the uptick is I don't think it's caused by level 3. I think it's caused by other reasons. Why there's been an uptick in the fatalities on the road. I don't think you can blame level 3 for that yet.
But I think level 3 will encourage it to go up. If I feel like, I'm on autopilot, I can be on Facebook. I think that's going to continue to be a challenge.
And one thing I actually just wanted to bring up, since you were bringing up safety, an interesting story I remember seeing from Slate over a year ago was, as the roads become safer, we're going to lose a significant source of organ donations. I have a figure right here. And I'm serious. I have a figure right here that says 1 in 5 organ donations come from the victim of a vehicular accident. So, what do you do when you don't have, hospitals are already in need of organs. What do you do if all of a sudden that's reduced even further? And we don't have to go into this. We can. But I just thought it was an interesting thing. I seriously think that's an entrepreneurial activity. How do you?
It's still going to die.
Right.
Whether it's in the car or not is secondary, but it's still going to die.
Where are those organs?
Plus, we can make organs from scratch at some point.
Well, and that's the real opportunity. So, all right. So, with that out of the way, sorry, I just felt like I remember reading this article.
I want to just fair to say none of us has researched that in detail.
yeah. I think we could have used like one more panelist for that. But anyways, so I wanted to talk more about what it means for real estate and urban planning and development, because, if you change the way that, people interact with cars, they're no longer going to have to necessarily park them. The cars don't necessarily have to stop. Like, what are cities of the future going to look like, and what are the opportunities to kind of help shape that future? Does someone want to take?
Sure. So I think that the death of parking is somewhat overwrought. We talk about how we're going to be able to utilize all these spaces, and it's true. When you look at new builds today, some people are actually plumbing and wiring assets that are being used for parking right now to be utilized for more office space in the near term. But we have a company in our portfolio, Park Mobile, that was just acquired by BMW. Very easy mobile pay-by-phone parking on street and off street. So I think when we think about this migration from driven to autonomy, from ICE engines, internal combustion engines, to electric, it's going to happen. It is happening, but it's going to happen over time. And so there's certainly going to be a tremendous amount of different ways in which we can think about using those assets. But I also think we should be rational around how we think about that migration. And that's an important starting point, I guess I'd say.
So it would probably be safer to say that the way cities change is going to be fairly slower than just a matter of 10
I think it's
years.
going to be slow, but I think we're at an inflection point too. We're finally at a point where cities are realizing that they have full purview over their data, that it can be utilized in a platform in which APIs can be drawn down and different systems or different services can be offered up. That's new, and that's going to make for tremendous, more efficient uses of public transit assets, of public roads, of ways in which we think about intermodal assets. But at the same time, we're at capacity with most of our public transportation assets around the world right now, especially in the West. It's not as if those things are going to not be used anymore. And this conversation can go in a lot of different directions, but efficiency is where I think we have a big opportunity as these systems roll out.
I agree. And I think it's a really multifaceted topic, because I think it's easy to pick one item and optimize for that. So if you look at Paris, for example, the deputy mayor of Paris for transportation was at NACTO, and he was showing like these 30 examples where he converted driving lanes to bike lanes or parks. And that in of itself is great. He gets more bikes on the street, he gets more people out, it gets greater environment for the population, but actually traffic gets much worse because it's not optimized as a holistic mobility system. And I think that's where cities really need to look at the holistic impact. In our simulation that we did for the city of Boston, we actually calculated you could get rid of about half of the parking spaces. But again, that's just one number based on one set of assumptions. Doesn't mean that's exactly what's going to happen. And also the question is, what do you really do with it? Does it all become parks, or do you actually need it? Because if you think about an environment where you have a lot of shared autonomous electric vehicles, you have a lot of drop-offs and pickups. How does that entire curb management work? Do you create areas where those cars get parked? Where do those cars actually go at night? If you have 100,000 of those floating around the city, where do they go at nighttime? Where is kind of their rest station? Where do they get charged? I think there's a lot of questions around real estate that aren't answered yet.
Yeah, and I think I remember seeing one of the concerns that led to legislation that eventually failed in the state was this idea of zombie cars, that you would just have this, like unused capacity that's just like driving the streets at night. One question I have is, we're going to have a lot of different kinds of companies, or just a lot of different companies either managing these cars or, doing maintenance on these cars. do we need something that kind of connects all of these cars together so that they're aware of each other, or that it's easier to have an understanding of what's on the road? Like, is there an opportunity in that space?
Well, they're going to be connected to each other and via the cloud as well as directly. Like 5G cellular V2X will connect the vehicles through the cloud and to the infrastructure and to pedestrians, cyclists, all road users, as well as directly for latency critical applications. So the vehicles will form a web of connectivity. So it's absolutely possible that they can share information with each other, and the fleets can share information with each other if they want as well. I think one of the interesting aspects of the parking is the link with electric charging, because you may have a different solution if these were gasoline powered vehicles, but the cost of a charging infrastructure may play a role in how you allocate parking,
right?
And whether it should be distributed or centralized and so forth. I think it's a very interesting trade-off that needs to be simulated.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think you're seeing a confluence of smart infrastructure and legitimate sort of smart city actions being taken. Cities are slow to move, and David Mendel, who's the CEO of one of the companies we've backed, a company called Humatics, professor here, he likes to say all the time that cities are going to look exactly like factories do today, but it's going to take some time, and we're steadily moving in that direction. So I think you see the infrastructure getting smarter and smarter. You see the vehicle-to-vehicle communications piece of it has also taken a long time. It's been talked about for forever, but you're finally starting to see the cost of implementing those solutions coming down, and the focus on it is ramping up because of all this autonomous vehicle development that's ongoing, et cetera. And you have finally this sort of notion that all of these assets do need to be communicating. And so I think you have, there's a world where people are willing to finance this. You have cities that are getting behind it. You have services that are now, being developed or thought through as to what can be built on top of it. If you think about vehicles as just roaming clusters of sensors, they become part of the infrastructure themselves, right? And if you think about the data that they can collect and generate, and what sort of services can be built on top of that data, that's what excites us every day. There's so much more to be done. We're just beginning this journey.
Talking about kind of the data that is created through all these vehicles, what could you potentially do with that data? I think we talked about this a little bit already, but can we just dive more into like what you could potentially do?
I think from a city perspective, when we talk to the city of Boston, it's like we would love to have the data, know where is every car, who's in it, what's the from and to, what are the stops, et cetera, et cetera. But right now, I don't think they have the capabilities to do much with that information, right? So the idea is to say I can regulate the traffic optimally if I know exactly where traffic is. I could think about dynamic tolling and taxing. So if I know that road has very high traffic between 8 and 9, I should charge more for people using that road between 8 and 9. I think the idea is very clear. I think how to get it done is actually very complicated, and the city is probably also not in the best spot to execute and needs private sector help. What I find interesting is Sidewalk Labs just found a new company, Cord, earlier this week, which is trying to kind of own the data piece, because I think that's a high area of friction, is who has access to the data. Right. The city says we would like to have it. Mm-hmm. Companies like Lyft, Waymo, whoever say, why would you give it to you? You're going to use it against us, right? So who can kind of play that role of the third party that makes sure that the right pieces of data get to the decision makers to optimize the system without infringing on privacy, without infringing on competitive advantage?
Just stay, and that's another great example.
Yeah, and if I could, just kind of both those last questions. You asked the question about what will tomorrow's cities look like. If we have autonomous vehicles, what's that going to look like? And I think the answer is we don't know, right? It's very difficult to predict what changes that will bring about. But as has been, I think, very much shown by all of the answers that we got here, there are a lot of different possibilities. And so it actually opens up an opportunity for us to ask, well, what do we want that city of tomorrow to look like? So as entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs wanting to serve our consumers, as researchers, as policymakers or politicians wanting to serve our constituents, what do people want, and what do we as communities want that to look like? Because I think this technology opens up a lot of possibilities. It's very difficult to predict, and maybe, I mean, it's nice to lay out scenarios and it can be fun, but to a, past a certain point, it may be a waste of time. Instead, let's think about what we want to do with this, and then with all of the data, what kind of data do we need? So in my mind, I work on climate change and energy, so I have a list of different kinds of data that I'm interested in, and it has to do with how people are behaving, consuming energy, and so forth. But depending on what your problem of interest is, what is the data that we need? There's tons of data. Sometimes it's what we need and what we want, and sometimes it isn't. But we have to think about what questions we want to answer, and kind of even more importantly, what sort of cities do we want to live in? How do we want to put this technology to use to solve problems that we care about?
Yeah.
I would
Oh, go ahead.
just add, if we really want, if we enjoy Big Brother, then you could have these vehicles going around and doing surveillance on steroids, and basically any outside activity in a city might be recorded.
Right.
I mean, that would have to rely on the data being, made available to enforcement agencies. But in principle, any outdoor activity, these vehicles are going to be roaming around all the time. It's like CCTV,
right,
but much more densely populated.
And that point's really important because the use case is important, right? How we put technology to work is important. And so when we think further afield around use of data, what excites me when I think about we can manage what we can measure. So what are the business cases that are excited? Well, in a city like Los Angeles, if you do simulation for traffic and overall utilization of all their major roadways and public trans, you can actually understand real time what is the full capacity of those roadways. And then if I look at that across population and travel times and necessity for those assets, what is the actual optimized fleet that I would require to service all of those needs? And so you can dial that in. And what if, by the way, you're actually able to have all of that fleet be completely autonomous within a contiguous area that you're able to make sure that those assets are available to people whenever they need them. And by the way, what if you actually had that number of vehicles you needed? You could make them autonomous, and you could buy them from third parties. You could buy that autonomous system from one party. You could 3D print every vehicle you needed. And by the way, from a regulatory perspective, you could say, our friends at Uber, you're not allowed in this geography. We're only going to have, LA Auto or something along those lines. Right now that's not a possibility, but we can manage what we can measure, and the cost of technology to put together those types of systems, whether it's by new startups or whether it's by really innovative incumbents, those futures are real, and that's exciting. Now, for us as citizens and as consumers, if I could tell everyone in this audience that I could bring down your transportation budget by 1/2 and have a vehicle that fits the need of your journey outside of your door within a 3-minute ETA, how many people in the world would sign up for that? We're going to be able to do that in our lifetime. That's exciting.
I wanted to go back to the energy piece because I think there's definitely a lot of companies out there right now that they thrive on doing energy analysis and also predictions. Is there? I can only imagine there must be opportunities in helping automotive companies or whoever is running these AVs. What's their energy consumption? How can they adjust to save money, save on energy? I can only imagine there must be opportunities in that space.
Well, there is. I mean, today's cars are over-engineered for urban applications, as we all know. They're designed to go 100 miles an hour, up hills, off-road and so forth. So if you design a vehicle for its intended use case, like a city application, and you have a lot of data to show how the vehicle is being used, like ride-sharing companies have, then you can optimize the design. You could basically spec out the design of the vehicle and have somebody make that vehicle to meet your needs. You might even create a standardized battery pack and do battery swapping. So instead of just thinking of high-power charging or wireless charging, battery swapping or fuel cells, there's different ways that these vehicles could be energized, even if they're all electric.
Right. What are can we talk a little bit more about the broad array of how AVs can be fueled in the electric spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about a use case where they have to drive 300 or 400 miles per day, and let's assume that they're not driving at night, although they may well be driving at night, but that would be a time when they get recharged or refueled. I mean, that could be a good use case for fuel cells, especially if you have centralized fueling stations, because with personally owned vehicles, everybody worries about being able to find a hydrogen gas station. It's not that easy, but if you're a centralized fleet managing a fleet of these autonomous vehicles, you could put a hydrogen dispenser in a depot at night and refuel it. Another alternative is wireless charging. If these vehicles are capable of driving autonomously, then wireless charging is quite an interesting idea. A third idea is battery swapping. If all the batteries are identical in a fleet, you could consider battery swapping as a possibility. And then high power conductive charging at 300 or 400 watts, kilowatts, could be an alternative. Although there's still some questions to be answered there in terms of durability on the batteries and so forth. Because if you're doing this every day, it's different than if you're just doing it occasionally, like you would for a personally owned vehicle.
So autonomy can affect energy consumption of cars in a number of ways. On the saving side, you could imagine, through differences, through changing driving style, you can save maybe 10% or more on your energy consumption per mile. So it could affect things in that way. If it enables more electrification of vehicles, you can get even greater savings. As I mentioned before, very substantial savings in greenhouse gas emissions. If you buy an electric car today, just a normal electric car, you can meet the 2030 emissions target that the US has set yourself, in terms of like your own behavior. Now, on the other hand, and also as was mentioned by Chris 3, I guess here. So as it was mentioned by Chris, you could potentially size cars to match people's needs better, and so the size of a car influences the energy consumption and the horsepower as well. But then on the negative side, in terms of travel behavior, if this induces people to drive a lot more, then they could consume much more energy. So there's a number of different levers, and I think there's solutions. If you do care about reducing energy consumption, there are solutions to each one. There's ways to incentivize, kind of people that behave in ways that are more energy efficient, and that can be through offering monetary rewards or other rewards. And then, there's ways as entrepreneurs, as policymakers, that we can really take advantage of the sizing, the driving style, and also the powertrain to really drive down energy consumption.
I think the shared mobility use case too is, fascinating when you think about what you can do to reduce energy needs there. Just by putting more people in seats, taking people off the road that way.
Like if I could just add, and if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, without changing powertrains, we're not going, so without kind of transitioning away from the internal combustion engine as the dominant powertrain, we're not going to be able to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet global climate targets and, the US commitment and the commitments that many cities and states have made. You just can't get there. So really, if we're talking about emissions, the way to put autonomy to use is to enable transition to a new powertrain, an electric. Now that could be a plug-in electric, or it could be a fuel cell vehicle, which is also electric. That would do it. As you reduce greenhouse gas emissions of electricity, you can drive emissions down even further. But yeah, it really has to enable that change in powertrain if you want to get those significant emission savings.
I think in addition to all the benefits we talked about, there's also a business case. We modeled a fleet of shared autonomous vehicles for Chicago, for example. So if you talk about 200,000 cars that operate 15 hours a day, 80% with people, maybe 20% zombie miles. But even if you make all those assumptions, we still looked at the cost per mile, and actually better electric vehicle is about 5 cents cheaper per mile than a combustion engine. Now, 5 cents doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about running it every day, 15 hours a day, 100,000, 200,000 vehicles, that really adds up quickly. And so for fleet operators, that will also be the smart business decision to do. in addition to all the benefits you
Yeah,
mentioned.
There's another knock-on effect here, which is if vehicles increasingly are sophisticated and can know their location because of GPS and are able to have their speed controlled to the appropriate level, so that they don't cause harm if they do get into a crash. You could imagine designing vehicles that don't have to meet all the crash requirements. I mean, the other scenario would be if cities decide to ban cars from the city center, which some cities in Europe are contemplating that idea. And in both of those scenarios, whether it's a low-tech regulatory approach or the high-tech, because the cars don't crash, you could really reinvent what the car looks like in terms of the materials that it uses, instead of being limited to the materials that we use today. And that could have a significant impact on energy consumption. So a lot of aspects here.
Speaking of materials used to make cars, one thing I was thinking about is you have, hundreds and thousands of auto repair shops. And what's going to happen to those auto repair shops when all of a sudden no one knows how to service an autonomous vehicle? Because all of a sudden you go from someone just needing to know how the ins and outs of a regular car, but what about knowing code and what about the operating system of the car? So I guess I have kind of like a multi-layered question, which is the first question is, are these autonomous vehicle makers going to let third parties service their cars? You're skeptical. All right. And if they do, is there an opportunity to kind of help those auto repair shops survive the wave of autonomy?
I think there's an opportunity for customization to a much greater level than you might see today, especially with the interior cabin experience. And then if we get to this future of being able to make vehicles out of completely different materials than today, they could even become manufacturers. You could easily imagine a dealership with a 3D printer potentially making quantities of vehicles that support the local environment that these vehicles are operating in.
That example is a great one, because I think it's going to be about repurposing, and it depends on what you mean by service.
Right.
So are we going to need for autonomous fleets in urban centers vehicles to be cleaned, vehicles to be charged, vehicles to have a place to go? Absolutely. When you think about dealership assets, when you think about parking assets, those are going to be repurposed.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be a tremendous amount of job creation for those types of jobs that don't exist today, because those fleets don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something that I think is going to be incredibly important when we think, again, about utility of assets and just optimization of how we're using that fleet.
I couldn't agree more. I think everybody's talking about, the dealer's going to die, the repair shop's going to die, the car rental companies are going to die, drivers are all going to be unemployed. I think there's actually huge opportunity in maintaining those fleets, because they have to be basically on a daily basis, right? If you have a car running around 15 hours a day, people getting in and out, there's a lot of maintenance and cleaning you need on a daily basis.
And that's a derivative opportunity. I mean, we have to think about what are the things we need to power the system. We're talking about electrification. Look at the state of the grid in the North American market. It's embarrassing. And so what is generating that power, and how are we going to ensure that with higher energy utilization for these electrification of fleets, that we have the ability to do that safely and reliably? And then the other thing that we have to keep in mind here, and data grounds us all, is that the average age of a vehicle in the United States is 11 and a half years old. The vehicles that are on the road today are going to take a long time to fall off. It's estimated by 2040, only 22% of overall fleet in the nation is going to be at pure plug-in electric. The majority is going to be hybrid, with still a fair amount of just traditional ICE. What does that mean? It means that there's going to be an opportunity, especially in urban centers, but we still have a lot of steel on the road that's going to be used in different ways.
Plus, I think our entire conversation is biased towards like the top 50 cities.
It's true.
Like
It's
in
exactly right.
rural Kentucky, I'm not going to replace my pickup with an autonomous on-demand service anytime soon. That's quite far out. Because you also don't have the density to optimize fleets that you run in profitably and guarantee the 3-minute arrival time. But if you have to wait for a car 20 minutes, it really loses its appeal.
The other piece that's related to this is, how does the liability shift, and where does it settle? Where does that pendulum settle? You have obviously the OEM, with the liability shifting increasingly that direction, or is it who creates the software that's running on the vehicle, or is it the driver, consumer? If you're outsourcing some of that maintenance and the servicing and repairs, right, it shifts back this way toward the owner of the asset, or toward away from so it's going to be interesting to see where it all settles out. But
yeah. One last piece I'll mention, because I think this was fascinating when I started to see this at this year's Detroit Auto Show, is that when you think about the sensor suites that are going to be on this autonomous vehicles, the individual assets you're using for perception, LiDAR, radar, and vision, how they're dialed in, what the sensor fusion is, how that vehicle's seeing the road around it, that's going to be incredibly important. And those sensors, they have to be clean. And so when you think about the necessity of that for that entire system to work, I had one tier 1 OEM or tier 1 supplier, which I won't name, who took me into their kind of super secret booth to show me the new technology that's coming out. And the new technology was all cleaning of sensors. And I was like, this is fascinating. He goes, this is going to be $100 billion business. And by the way, when we go to electric, when we take out the compartment that you're currently hosting your gas in, that's going to be a huge repository for just window wiper fluid. We're going to have hundreds of millions of gallons of fluid in the vehicle to clean sensors to make sure autonomous systems can work. And it's like mundane, but it's a huge opportunity, and it's going to be a part of that servicing aspect of the autonomous vehicle.
Yeah, that's just fascinating. I didn't even think about that one. Kind of going on the cleaning, I think someone else brought it up, but especially the shared autonomous vehicles, they're going to get messy like throughout the day. So that's going to be another thing where it's like, do we need cleaning crews? Like, is that going to be? And are they going to be human cleaning crews, or are we going to have robots that are going to be smart and agile enough to kind of get in there? And
then will humans clean the robots? Or will robots clean the robots?
I mean, and service the robots and just
the autonomous vehicle cleaner.
Yeah, it's high end.
What about cybersecurity? Because is there a concern? Is there any concern that these cars can be hackable? Yes, I mean,
concern for sure.
Yeah, so it seems like if there's cybersecurity companies for all sorts of things that we mainly deal with on the desktop level, are we just have we even seen the beginning of what security looks like for AVs?
So we've spent a lot of time looking at this, and I'll be as succinct as I can. We looked globally at every firm that's servicing mobility assets from a cybersecurity perspective. So not just auto, but mobility holistically. And what we saw, as you pointed out, was a lot of enterprise solutions that were being repurposed for auto, which by definition have a variety of issues that, from a technical perspective, are not auto grade. It can't be that I may have a false positive that can take my car careening off a bridge. That's not an auto grade product. So we invested in a company called Carumba Security, which focused uniquely on this. It's not just detection, and their process is not to have a malicious packet enter a system, be identified, be quarantined, and be scrubbed. That can't be a part of a process in a vehicle that's I'm in or that's affecting other people. They're looking to prevent viruses from coming into the vehicle to begin with. Mm-hmm. But that is a fairly unique approach, and it doesn't sound novel, but it is. But safety and cybersecurity you could offer as an extension of used to be, how do we pay for that to the consumer? It's optional. Will they pay for it? Will the tier 1? Do we find some way to charge for it? Cybersecurity is not optional. It was a couple years ago. Now it's something that is a must-have for every component of that vehicle, and it's going to be a huge marketplace.
Yeah. We have about 4 minutes for our Q&A, and then we're going to go to audience and Facebook Live Q&A. I guess if anyone else has anything else to say about, what have we not talked about? Because I feel like this cannot encapsulate this in 1 hour.
One thing that I worry about is the surplus of batteries that are going to be flooding the market if these vehicles are driving 40 or 50,000 miles per year. I think that'll create new industries, in terms of companies that are willing to take on the liability and certify these batteries as a used battery. Just like we have certified used vehicles, we'll need certified used batteries that can be then sold for other applications. But I think that's going to be a big market. Mm-hmm.
I think vehicle design is going to change fundamentally, right? If you look at interiors right now, it's very clear everybody sits in the seat and faces forward. If you look at any images of the future, even from the 60s or 70s, it has like this nice table where the family of four is facing each other playing cards. But if you look at our actual behavior, do we actually really want to talk to each other in the car, or is everybody just going to be on their phone? Right? So I think it's more what multimedia environment do we need to have in the car? Is that like maybe the windows become an OLED screen and I just project what's on my phone in the car? Also a question of what is premium? Right now, a premium vehicle is relatively clearly differentiated. I have nicer leather, I have maybe a better engine, I have better interior, touch and feel quality. What is premium in a shared autonomous vehicle? Do I have more space? Do I have more electronic equipment I can use? Do I have more privacy? So I think those are a lot of questions that haven't really been answered. And I think the other piece is, if we think about this being, as you said earlier, half the cost to the consumer of a personal car right now, it becomes so attractive on short trips to do that instead of walking to the T, waiting for the T, taking it 2 stops, and then walking. I'm just going to go door to door for the same price. So when we take people out of public transit onto the road, I think it's imperative that we share the vehicle. So how do you get people to share? Fundamentally, nobody really wants to hang out with strangers in a car, especially if there's no driver as kind of the safety net if something goes wrong. But if it's cheap enough, everybody's going to do it. So I think finding that right medium of what's the right pricing structure and what's the right vehicle design. It's probably not a 4-seater, it's maybe more a 12, 15-seater. I think this is what we call the autonomous minibus. Is going to be a really hot topic going forward.
One more thing I wanted to bring up is, wayfinding apps have kind of become popular in the last few years in terms of saying, you want to get to from point A to point B, you should take the train, or you should, take a cab or Uber or a bike. And, is there going to be a kind of wayfinding where it kind of gives you incentives to take the train or take an autonomous vehicle? Like, are there going to be ways to kind of nudge people into certain directions?
I think there'll be market-based incentives, and there should be. But the other piece I would kind of posit is that we're talking very much about ground transportation here. We're thinking about this in terms of 4 wheels going from A to B. I believe strongly, for most of us in this room, we're going to have VTOL as a key component of our transit every day, vertical takeoff and landing. So again, we're going to be taking a autonomous vehicle to a launch pad nearby. We're going to jump into an aerial asset. We're going to go from one city center to a next, or not too far away. We're going to get there. We're going to bike. We're going to walk. We're going to take a autonomous, ferry from one point to the next. We have a truly holistic system here, and I think that's important to make sure we always come back to. It's not just the evolution of the automobile. It's the evolution of the movement of man. That's what we have a chance to do in this part of our history.
And if I could just still respond to that. So we're actually working on a project to create a marketplace for tokens to incentivize people to make energy and emission savings decisions. It's called the Tripod Project, and it's funded by ARPA-E. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the city of Boston, and we're saying, okay, given how people are driving in Boston, how would we allocate tokens to drivers? And these tokens can be turned in for the purchase of goods and services. So the idea is to get local businesses to participate in this marketplace. If you make an energy saving choice, you get basically a certain amount of money back, but it's tokens, it's money that you can use in participating local businesses. And the science part of it is to understand how to allocate these tokens in order to maximize energy savings, and then also to understand people's preferences. So there's also a component of it where we're surveying people to understand what people are willing to do to give them the choices that will optimize energy savings for the system as a whole. So it's very much what you mentioned, and I do think that the next wave of innovations, I'm hoping, will really hold business like that. I feel like consumers are holding businesses more and more to account. So, it's not enough just to say that my car sharing service saves energy and saves emissions. Does it really show me the evidence and how much? And I think the apps and the businesses that are able to do that in the future will hopefully have an advantage. I think we'll have an advantage as consumers demand this information.
Right. I think that's going to be the regular part of our panel. Do we want to start doing some audience questions? All right, I'm going to start. Okay, yeah. Please, so when I choose you, just stand up and ask your question.
Yeah, so one of the fears that automakers have going into the future excuse me, is that they will become the equivalent of handset manufacturers when the vehicles are all automated. So thinking creatively, what alternatives would the automakers invest in to avoid that future?
And so you're asking, what are the alternatives to invest in to avoid the future of making the equivalent of heads?
So the concern is that in an fully automated world where we subscribe to a fleet service, we or they'll be in a race to the bottom, much the way that cell phone handset makers
Right.
are
Okay. Yeah.
presently. And so the question to the panel is, what are the creative alternatives for the automakers looking towards an increasingly automated future that would help them to avoid this?
Okay, I'm going to just repeat the question because we have Facebook, not Facebook, just live stream audience members as well. So the question is, what can automakers do to avoid, kind of becoming not that important, in the way that handsets have, that phones have for the most part?
I don't know if I'll tell you anything new, Jane, but I think if you look at the profit pools right now in the automotive industry, it's very much vehicle sales, part sales, financing. And in the future, our predictions are that about 40% of the profits will actually be in mobility as a service and delivering that service. Now, I think we all know that there's not going to be the same number of mobility service providers as OEMs today. So there will be winners and losers along the way. And I think it's important to be ahead of the game on this one, to be one of those leading platforms. I think if you look at the Detroit 3 right now, I think GM has been very early and very active in the... What do you mean by Detroit 4? Who's the fourth? Somewhat. But GM's been
I'm from Detroit. I'm not aware of that, but I'll.
GM's been very active. They have Maven. They've invested in Lyft. They bought Cruise, etc. Ford's putting a lot of money behind. I think what we already see is that Fiat Chrysler is just delivering cars to Waymo. So they're already on the track of becoming the contract manufacturer. So I think it's already starting to look a little bit like two separate paths OEMs are taking.
I thought you were talking about American Motors for a minute. I got really excited. When you so I think that's right. And the Foxconn example is apropos. I think that's the outfit that makes most of the iPhones around the world. And so, do auto companies want to press metal at 1 to 2% margins, or do they want to provide a service at 40 to 50? And that's the key question. And so, to your question, what are they actually doing? They're actually doing a lot. And when we started our firm in 2008, 2009. It was very lonely in the land of people that were talking about we can innovate mobility and transportation. But when you look at companies like Ford setting up their Ford Smart Mobility division and a huge focus on the future of that space, when you see GM acquiring Cruise for their autonomous assets, making big investments, $500 million in Lyft to get an understanding of TNC's transportation network companies and how they could run a service model. You look at Movell, which is related directly to Daimler and buying a lot of data companies, BMW Ventures, and a lot of corporate ventures amongst the OEMs globally, saying we're going to invest in these young companies to acquire, to partner, and to look at new ways to service, to provide services to our customers. Are all of these OEMs going to survive? I'd answer probably not. You're going to see some consolidation, or you're going to see just contraction. But those that move today, those that decide they want to be a part of the future of mobility, I think are going to do very well. And then Fiat Chrysler is a fascinating example because they're just choosing just to manufacture. And they're going to manufacture incredibly efficiently, and they're going to partner with systems. And when you look at just the public market price, they've done the best to date. And so it's interesting to see how they're being rewarded by Wall Street on the choices they're making.
So Toyota, by the way.
I love, well, fair enough.
All right. We're gonna move to the next question. Sorry.
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said here. I mean, there's going to be some winners and losers among the car makers for sure. But the winning car makers, there is still an opportunity for product innovation.
Yes,
the vehicle that has the most compelling user experience, the vehicle that has the most compelling maneuverability or cost of operation. Those are things that are going to be increasingly important in the future. And some car companies will excel. And then the premium on quality and safety. I mean, will all of these vehicles made by different car companies be equally safe in an absolute sense? I don't know. There may be ratings or rankings. Some are more safe than others.
Yep.
I don't know. But safety may still be a distinguishing feature, or cybersecurity protection.
All right. I think we're just going to go to you. So just to repeat the question for our live stream members, why haven't telecom companies like AT&T gotten more involved in the development of autonomous vehicles? And we'll start with that one.
I just said I don't think it's for lack of trying. Actually, I think there's a big focused effort, and there has been, at least since we founded our firm, by that group to play an important role. As you point out, they should be playing an important role. And I think part of it has to do with the OEMs trying to figure out what their own strategies are, and they feel threatened by some of the technology companies that are already trying to bring their services into the vehicle. And so there's a little bit of gamesmanship and just people starting to figure out, like, where are we in this, and how do these partnerships come together that benefits everyone? But I think you're seeing more and more of it. So it's.
I actually think there's a huge opportunity when we talk about the data, trying to figure out how to optimize the system. Nobody right now has perfect visibility of who's traveling where, but telecom companies actually do know quite a lot of where everybody is. Obviously, there's privacy concerns we have to work through, but I think there's an untapped opportunity for them to monetize that.
Did you want the other part of your question addressed? So I think the question is, how do smart sensors in infrastructure impact autonomous vehicles?
I mean, it's a good question. With any, there is a sort of energy cost of information processing in general, right? So that is something that we have to look at and are looking at increasingly. Where is that trade-off as you have all of these smart systems? I mean, technically, from a technical potential perspective, you would save more energy than you would consume for that information processing. But we have to look at that carefully, because it's not negligible. And there's a lot of ways in which we process information that's really inefficient right now. And there's an energy cost to that.
And I would just offer there's a really exciting profit motive when it comes to those opportunities. You have revenue generation as well as cost mitigation. A lot of thought-leading DOTs, even smaller cities or counties around the country right now, are partnering with companies and saying, how are we looking at road maintenance, bridge maintenance, and then very pinpoint laser-like deployment of our services, municipal services or otherwise, to maintenance those assets. That's really exciting, and it's something that I think as a new generation of municipal leaders come in and are willing to try new technology approaches to service those assets, we're going to see more of a governmental spend put toward higher efficiency, technology-driven solutions, and we're going to see the market come to that because there's finally a meeting in the minds around people that are willing to pay for the deployment of that technology.
All right, we're going to go to the next question.
If somebody from Ford were here tonight as part of the panel, how would they describe the autonomous cars they're going to bring out in 2020? What's the profile? Who's the customer? What's their introduction strategy?
All right, so I think the question is, what's basically Ford's autonomous vehicle strategy? Has anyone been following that closely?
So I think the question is a little leading. So Chris and I have the pleasure of founding our firm alongside some great men and women, one of which is Bill Ford, the executive chairman of Ford Motor Company. We're separate and distinct from Ford, but we work closely with their team as they're thinking about the next generation of mobility. The nice thing about our mandate is we do that with OEMs around the world. So we've sold companies now and we've invested alongside BMW, Volvo, Ford, GM, Mercedes, and the like. But I can't speak for Ford, but what I will say is I think there is just a tremendous amount of focus on where the future of mobility is going, how autonomy is going to play, and what are the opportunities from a individual vehicle perspective, a service model perspective, and everything in between. And the one thing I would put out there is there was a comment made earlier around, there's an expectation of lower volume of overall vehicles as a result of autonomy. That may or may not be true, but the use case of that vehicle is going to change. We're no longer going to have vehicles that are made to last 15 years and have 200,000 miles on them over the course of that 15 years, we could have 200,000 miles on them in the course of 3 months and never stop moving. So if we're generating vehicles that can be utilized in short periods of time, but we're generating many more, again, that use case is going to be really important. I would never dream of speaking for Ford, but I'm impressed by what they're doing. Put it that way.
All right. I think we'll go up there. Yes, you. All right, so the question is, what are like the features and benefits that will drive to mass adoption of autonomous vehicles?
I think it depends a little bit of what the starting point is, right? So if you look at someone who has a personal vehicle today, actually one of the by far biggest pain points in cities is finding parking. So when we did consumer research, the number one reason why people were excited about AVs is I don't have to deal with parking and having to find parking, plus also paying for parking, right? So I think there's an economic advantage where we say about, in our calculations, a personal car costs about $1.22 per mile to operate. Now, nobody ever thinks about that because you don't have no cash outflow, right? You can grab the car and drive somewhere, it's free, but it's not really free. If you take into account buying the car, depreciation, maintenance, parking, fuel, et cetera, it's about $1.22. Now, a shared autonomous electric vehicle could be about half of that. So about 55 to 70 cents per mile. So that's just an economical reason where you can say, I can actually forego vehicle ownership. Instead of having to pay for my garage and having to pay for my car and having to pay for parking everywhere I go, I just get this on demand. I think the other group is folks that use public transit today, which is already very price competitive, but you get a huge boost in convenience and comfort. As I said earlier, you don't have to walk anywhere. You don't have to stand at the station. You don't have to deal with the elements if it's raining. You don't have to deal with delays. You get on your phone an immediate feedback, when is the car coming? And it's usually within a few minutes if you have large fleets. So I think it's one is cost, the other one is comfort and convenience. Plus, on the convenience front, you have a guaranteed seat. It's not, oh, how full is the train today and who else is there? And maybe the guy next to me didn't shower this morning. It is, I have my seat. I have a clear understanding of what I'm going to get. You can probably pay for different levels of car. You can say, okay, I'm going to be in a car with 4 people and that's what I'm paying for. Or I'm paying for a car to be by myself because I have a conference call. You can really determine your experience before you get in the car.
But I think we have to be careful because we don't know if that will happen in the sense of the, if everybody decides to do exactly that, then the roads could be congested, and then it may not be any quicker than if you walk to it yourself, or it may take longer. So I think we have to be very cognizant of the fact that what might make sense for one person when it's scaled to the whole population because it's so attractive can give a very different result. And I think the jury is still out on how it will play out. And I think we need to recognize that.
I think it's personal trade-offs and, as you said, use cases. Like the other day, I made a decision that probably environmentally was horrible, but I took a trip in Manhattan in an Uber, and it took 48 minutes. And then I looked at my receipt and said I drove 1.3 miles. But for me, it was the right choice because I was on a phone call and I was doing emails in parallel. So I was like, I don't want to walk around and stand somewhere. I just want to have my work time. So I really didn't care that it took that long or that was that inefficient. So I think it's the individual trade-off between timing, convenience, and cost.
And I think that's where, wayfinding apps can also provide some transparency into, what certain decisions mean, whether it's how long will it take or how much will it cost, could even break down, how much energy am I using. I will go to the next question. I will go right here. And so the question is, And so the question is basically, you know, when you're talking about cross-country travel or cross-continental travel for vehicles, you know, how are you going to deal with the data processing issues and all the privacy laws and so it's basically about, you know, how are our autonomous vehicle companies going to deal with the kind of the different laws across different countries regarding data privacy, data isolation, and things like that.
I know I have difficulty going to Canada from Detroit, crossing it with an Uber. I mean, it's difficult to go across the border. So I'm wondering if we have these shared fleets, may have a similar issue.
But I think realistically it comes back to a point I made earlier about that you can just get an autonomous car and it works and goes everywhere. It's really far away. I think all those fleet environments will be geo-fenced, where it says, okay, within this part of Boston, you can go wherever you want. Within this part of Singapore, you can do whatever you want. But I don't think we'll have complete, I just get in a car and I can go to any place I pick. I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
But it's an important question when we think about the fulfillment of this vision. And so I think we're going to see protocols and the necessity of kind of, whether it be token or otherwise, that validates those assets as they move from geolocation to geolocation, whether that's city to city or nation state to nation state. I also think this brings up a really interesting point that doesn't come up in these discussions very much. How does autonomy change human trafficking, narcotic movements, terrorism? These are real questions. And they're analogous and they're adjacent to that question as to how do we think about use, how do we think about security, how do we think about movement outside of the idealized versions that we talk about a lot? Those are going to be real questions that we are, as a society, are going to have to answer.
Right. I'm going to try to keep going. I will do you over here. So the question is, you know, what? I'm sorry. You're asking just like what? Are there alternatives? Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, what's the future of logistics? Are we going to have self-driving 18-wheelers, or are those going to be manned, or are there going to be other ways to transport goods?
Well, I think I can't speak for the trucking companies, but I think you'd keep a trucker, you'd keep a driver in there, at least until you've proven that it's completely safe and that others have been convinced that it's safer than before. You may even have a remote control operation as well, where you have somebody in the back office watching as well. So I think it has the potential to be a lot safer than today, until it gets to a point where you feel confident enough that you can get rid of the driver. So I'm not so worried about it being less safe, because I don't think that would be allowed to be happening. And then the driver during that time can be perhaps more productive if he's not having to focus 100% of his attention driving, but he's just there as oversight. He might be able to be more productive. So there could be some very useful benefits for the trucking company, as well as fuel economy savings and reduced accidents and so forth. In terms of what the right size of vehicle is, you're right. I think the logistics is going to go through an optimization of what the right type of vehicles should be for different use cases. And where that plays out, I don't know, but there is definitely opportunity. Maybe you have instead of a large rig, maybe it's a series of 2 or 3 that are platooned together, and they can go off separately when they need to, but travel as a convoy.
I think it really depends on the application, right? So if you think about 18-wheel, I think highway is the biggest application where it makes sense. As a consumer perspective, when I was at Audi, we had cars that arrived at Port of Houston and had to go to Chicago. And it was like a 2-day drive, and the guy had to take a however long hour break, and it took forever. So if you could optimize it, that you still have the driver on the car, but it becomes more of a customer service person. So he's there to load the vehicles, make sure there's no damage. Then the car, he drives it to the highway. On the highway, he can basically take his nap while the car is driving. Highway, you can optimize relatively easily with platooning. The street is relatively clear marked. The rules are very clear. Once you get off the highway, he takes over again. So I think that's actually a use case that makes a ton of sense and could happen relatively quickly. I think if you look at inner cities, we're going to see the opposite trend towards more smaller vehicles. So instead of having all these UPS trucks go from one central depot and all drive into the city at the same time and creating a huge traffic jam, we look more maybe at micro depots where you take entire containers and put them in a part of the city, and then you have maybe bicycles for the last mile, which can ride on the sidewalk. So you really want to get more trucks out of the city. Because if you look at traffic throughout the day, if you look at commuter traffic, you have a peak in the morning, you have a peak in the evening. If you get personal traffic, you have a little bit around lunch, and you have a after work peak. But commercial vehicle traffic really starts at 7 a.m. and then it's 10,000 cars in Boston until 7 p.m. It doesn't really taper off. So one of the unlocks for congestion is really how do we reduce that number of cars? Be it having smaller vehicles or also moving it to the nighttime. And I think nighttime is one where electric vehicles comes in because it's also a little bit of the noise issue. Where right now it's just too much of a disturbance to have trucks running through the city at night.
All right, going to try to get a few more questions in. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, I'm just going to make sure I kind of spread around. All right, you in the red. So the question is, with the proliferation of autonomous vehicles, there is a current, so before AVs ever even happen, there's already a shortage of technicians. Will the development of AVs exacerbate that issue, or will it incentivize people with more tech backgrounds to kind of get into that field?
I mean, I think 5 years ago, there was a lot of discussion in Detroit and other large industrial centers around the lack of individuals that were excited about automotive. I don't think that's the case today. The talent that's coming into this space, holistic mobility in automotive has never been higher, and the quality of men and women that we're seeing coming in is off the charts. I think the answer to your question really goes to how do we as a country and how do individuals or how do schools that are defining this craft define a trade? So my father, he made artificial limbs. He started about 40 years ago when he was crafting leather with his hands, or and servicing, wooden stumps or wooden legs for stumps. When you think about where we're moving, I think a trade in terms of being an autonomous vehicle technician is going to be incredibly valuable. I think the market is going to provide great salaries for those individuals that choose to come into that space, and it's incredibly exciting for those people that want to be there. So I think we're going to see a convergence of, again, when my dad started, he was a high school grad. And he could walk right in, and he was like being a cobbler. Now there's 6-year guys coming out of master's degrees at Northwestern to build robotic limbs. I think we're seeing that transition with the trades 2.0, and that's really exciting for individuals that want to work with their hands, that want to build, and I think it's going to be exciting for that space.
All right, I'm going to try to just do a couple more. You say right there. Yep. So basically the question is, where else are we going to see autonomous vehicles be used, whether it's in a military setting or I think you said in a factory setting as well. So someone take that.
So I'll just say that we see a lot of deal flow in that general arena, and a lot of exciting deal flow. I think you're right that there's a here and now for many of the use cases that you're describing. So I think if from a financing standpoint, yes, I mean, we like things where we can generate a return quickly. So, and I think some of the things we're talking about today will take time to play out, but that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities, in that whole spectrum that you can finance today and generate a quick return as well. But
right. One additional comment. I'm a U.S. Army vet, and so when you think about the derivative opportunities to save lives with those technologies in the field, when you think about the superiority of our military from a technical perspective, which allows us to do what we can do in the field, those things that are very real and incredibly important. And so we love the fact that we can do really well financially in this market. But the second and third order effects of this evolution, this autonomous revolution, are really important in terms of lives saved, in terms of lives improved, in terms of just how we're going to be able to affect the world.
All right, just going to take one more question. All right, this is going to be hard. Sorry, guys. All right, we're going to do you on the left right there. Yes, you. All right, so the question is, for municipalities, vehicles are a significant source of revenue through various means, parking receipts, even excise tax. What kind of impact will that have, and how will the autonomous space deal with that?
I think one of the biggest answers is charging for road usage, right? So be it in a dynamic toll environment or be it just also in a occupancy-based environment. Once you have the right data sets that you can actually pinpoint who's in the car when, you could charge more for rides that are with single occupancy than for rides with 4 people in the car. So I think the road there is a little bit bumpy and a lot of cities don't know how to get there. But I think the answer of how to generate that revenue is relatively straightforward.
I would also add that I think municipalities have an opportunity to rethink public transport and the subsidies that currently are used to pay for that. There's an opportunity with what we're talking about to reduce the need for those heavy subsidies by allowing public transport to operate in corridors and areas where it really makes sense economically and environmentally, and have mobility as a service support maybe the suburbs and off-peak times and so forth. So there's an opportunity for municipalities to save money, and in some municipalities own land. Not all cities own some of the land in their cities, but the ones that do may be able to sell real estate that's no longer needed for parking, which could be another revenue source. And then there may be some other opportunities down the road. If people are drinking more because they're not driving, because they're in autonomous vehicles, maybe there's a consumption tax that they can generate. If it's in, who knows? I mean, they can get creative.
Cheers to that. We're going to let Vanessa wrap up.
If I could just add, sorry, I
Oh,
just
yes,
want
sure.
to, because we haven't flagged this at all,
Great
but
segue to
this
the cocktail.
question
Right.
is a good intro to that. The equity question is really important. So to think about serving not just, residents that can afford the latest technology, but also residents that really rely on public transport to get to work, maybe working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, and traveling long distances on public transport. So, those sorts of questions, equity related questions, are really important for what you're talking about as well, and municipalities to think about.
Right, exactly. All right, great.
Well, thank you very much to Dylan and the panel. Really excellent, intriguing conversations. And in the spirit of spirits, we have some spirits upstairs in the 4th floor. And I'd love you all to join us up there where the panel will be to answer any further questions that you might have. And thanks all for coming. Bye-bye. Oh, actually, I'll see you up there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was fun.
That was fun?
Yeah.